This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern, and today, just like any other day, I'm joined here in the studio by my trusted co-host, Dalia Shendlin. Hello, Dalia.
Hi,
Welcome
Gilad.
back.
Nice to be here.
And our guest today is a post-doctoral fellow at Concordia University's Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies. He is researching the history of the Israeli Communist Party. Today we're going to discuss a paper that he published in the latest issue of the Israel Studies Review, a favorite bedtime reading of mine and of many other millions around the world, I'm sure. The paper is entitled War and Memory, the Israeli Communist Commemoration of the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1986. And it offers a comparative perspective on an issue that became a cause célèbre for progressive groups around the world. Joining us on the line from underneath the snow in Montreal, Canada, is Dr. Amir Locker-Biletzky. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you. Good morning to me and good afternoon.
Good afternoon to us, yeah. Okay, so let's start by the Spanish Civil War became this, as I said, a cause célèbre for progressive groups, especially communists, around the world, more than other instances of left-wing bravery, such as the resistance fighters or the partisans or whatever. Why do you think is that?
Because in Spain there was a very obvious involvement of fascism, which was on the march in the 1930s. I think you have to remember this is the Great Depression. So a lot of people are unemployed. There's a lot of anger, a little bit like today, a lot of anger against capitalism as a system that looks that it doesn't work. For the Jewish volunteers, the rise of really rampant anti-Semitism. And that drove people to fight in Spain. 40,000 people. I mean, the largest ever volunteer army in the world. Although there were cases over history of volunteers coming, this is the largest number.
Yeah, but before we get to the actual historical event of the mobilization, global mobilization of volunteers, I'd like to know about the commemoration. Why is it looked up to as the ideal type of ideological commitment in a war that was lost at the end of the day?
And I have to add to that. I mean, your paper in your research, you actually call it a cult. Certainly, the commemorations in pre-Israel Yishuv period. What do you mean by cult, and how did it get to that level where we could even consider describing it as a cultish sort of appreciation and commemoration of that war?
Because there is a cult. I don't mean that it's a group of people, just a sect of people talking about something nobody understands. It's a cult because it's periodic. It's always mainly in the Communist Party newspaper. They do have some rituals, although nothing on the scale that, let's say, East Germany have. And a lot of it is and this is maybe the cultish kind of commemoration. A lot of it is imbued in almost religious language. Fascism as a Satan in a layer that is feeding on the blood of, feeding of the blood of the innocents. This kind of imagery, and this cosmic battle between good and bad, democracy and tyranny. All those things that exist, let's say, in the Western cult of Western, meaning Western Europe and mainly the United States, the cult around the Spanish Civil War, also seep into the Israeli communist one. So this is why I call it sort of a cult.
Okay. I mean, you've raised something that I think is really fascinating about your research. You're talking about a conflict that, as Gilad pointed out, it wasn't just Israel. Many countries around the world, people around the world sort of, were just compelled by this. It seems like they saw it and maybe remember it as a real conflict of a dichotomous good over evil, as you had pointed out in your research. And that unifies people in a very simple way. Black and white. We know who's right and who's wrong. Do you think that this is something we long for because nowadays we have a much harder time finding examples of sort of political causes that are so obviously black or white. I mean, even if you think about Israel itself, Israel primarily divides the Jewish community these days. Everybody's squabbling over what it should be. And then if we look at, major conflicts like Syria, I mean, even today, what's going on this moment, everybody wants to think Assad is the bad guy and responsible for butchery. But we're having a major debate going on in Israel right now over the spokespeople for the Hadash, the Hadash party in Israel. Just this very day has been arguing dramatically because they came out in favor of they tried to make a statement that the conquest of Aleppo is liberation from terrorism, and they've been attacked. Are we having trouble these days finding conflicts that are so clearly right or wrong? And is that why we long for the ones that may be romanticized in the past, like the Spanish Civil War?
Yes, definitely. The Spanish Civil War had a moral clarity. Not on the ground, the historical realities were, of course, much more complex. But at the end of the day, you had a Spanish republic that was democratically elected against forces of really conservatism, fascism. The Nazis were there. I mean, that's a clear evil to anyone with eyes in his head in the 1930s. The Italian fascists. So, yeah, there was a moral clarity. And I think the Spanish Civil War and the romanticization still of the Spanish Civil War among progressive people still signifies a longing for a really clear moral cause. And I read about what Hadash put out, and the morality the morality of causes in the world today is much more ambiguous than it was in the 1930s.
All right, let's rewind 80 years and go back to 1936 when Jewish communists, especially communist men, started leaving to Spain from pre-state Israel, from Palestine, British-ruled Palestine, en masse. We're talking about several thousands of young men in a tiny, tiny, tiny yishuv, and even a smaller communist circles. That departure almost completely depleted the Communist Party and communist circles at the time. Can you tell us a bit about the background to their leaving and how it was received in the mainstream Yishuv leadership and the more contrarian Communist Party?
The Yishuv was divided according to political factions, political camps about the war. There were some that were just neutral; it's not our business. In the revisionist right, there were people that supported the nationalists. But generally, in the labor movement, the Zionist labor movement, everybody supported the republic, from Mapai to Hashomer HaTzair, those kind of organization. But when it comes to go and volunteer in Spain, send young people, the Zionist left was against it. It was much more important to be in Palestine, in Eretz Israel, and to build the Zionist project.
In other words, that was just a prioritization. It's more important for us, more urgent for us right now to build the issue.
And it's also ideology. At the end, Zionism, for even the most ardent Zionist socialists, at the end, socialism is coming second place. Zionism is much more important. So you can, send medical aid, you can fundraise, those kind of things. You can be in some organization. They do that even with communists. But going there and fight, we weren't going to send our young men to do that. And the people, those Zionists, around, I think, 10 Zionists that went to Spain, David Kron, for instance, that was the deputy head of the Mossad in later years, went against the wishes of their movement. And, back then the collective was much more important than today. And they went against the will of their movement. When it comes to the communists, at the beginning, they're indeed against their members going to volunteers. The Communist Party is small, very small, persecuted by the British and the Zionists. And, you don't want to let precious cadre go. Maybe you won't have communism in Palestine at the end. But when they started to understand that, the British themselves deport people, communists that they were in their jails, giving them tickets and passport and say, goodbye, please don't come back, if possible. And they understood that the Comintern itself, that the Soviet Union is behind the voluntary movement. So they consented and they let some people go. I don't think it depleted completely the Communist Party, which was indeed small, but not that small. But there were arguments among communists if to go or not to go. But quite a lot of people went. I think the numbers range. We don't know exactly the number. The party claimed there were 600 people that went to Spain. That's an exaggeration. We are talking about 120, maybe 300, if we'll be more liberal in our counting of people, because there were some people that were already in Europe, but they had Palestinian pass and they went to Spain. So it's a little bit murky.
Mm-hmm. I think I think that your research on this raises a very interesting thematic question, which to my mind is, you're looking at a sort of tension between the Zionists who are, committed to a nationalist cause, essentially, the establishment of the Shuv, the State of Israel. But at the same time, they have these sort of universalist cosmopolitan principles of, socialism and international solidarity. And that's what you explained how the Zionists resolved that. But the communists, obviously, if they were in Palestine, shared some of the nationalist element, but they also had these international cosmopolitan leanings that were much more, prominent for them. What is the nature of this tension between universalist or cosmopolitan causes and the nationalist or tribalist struggles? Can they, who wins out in the end? I mean, and you also point out that even the Spanish Civil War was a little bit misrepresented in their minds because it also contained very much a national element.
How does it play out? I think it plays out through the history of the Israeli left all over, all the time. Are we for the Soviet Union? Or are we not for the Soviet Union? Soviet Union, this great dream out there in the East that we need to follow, and not our national aspirations or less our national aspirations. For Zionists, I think at the end it always won out by nationalism. Mm-hmm. For the communists, well, they were small, but it's obvious that they were much more internationalist. It was much more easier to them. For the rest of the question, if you can repeat it once.
Well, I'm just wondering if that characterizes people everywhere. I mean, maybe it's true that over the course of history, the national and tribal, the more local dimension, maybe tends to win out over the universalist, cosmopolitan approach.
Yeah. I mean, for the historical final account, the nation state, nationalism, even in the Soviet Union, China, other communist countries, at the end there is a core of nationalism that even communists go to. When it comes to the communists in Palestine, at the end even they become much more, and I show it in the research and I show it in some other places, how they take on a lot of elements, even unconsciously, elements from Zionism.
Tell us more about that. Give us a few examples.
The most telling example is the poster boy for the commemoration of the communists. It's Mark Millman. He's a volunteer to Spain. He's a son of a son. He comes from the Ukraine in 1922. His father was murdered during the pogroms that followed the Russian Civil War, the Petrolia in the Ukraine. And he goes to Spain. First, he goes to studies in France, and then he goes to Spain, and he gets to be a captain in the 15th Brigade, which is mostly an American unit. And he gets killed in 1938 on the Ebro River, which is the last attack, the last effort at attacking of the Republic, which is the last gasp of the Republican army. And he's killed there by a sniper. When you look at his commemoration, and he was commemorated mainly by a text named Jewish Captain in Fighting Spain, and you make a comparison to another iconic book, friends talk about Johnny, about the 1948 war, the similarities are striking. The way Millman and Johnny are depicted is very similar. They are both, sort of a little bit hard on the exterior, but very sensitive. Both love their moms, the good, good kids.
We wouldn't know anything about that stereotype over here.
Yeah, no, it's nothing. We don't know. You see how even there are the similarities in their politics.
Which are what? Can you talk about the similarities of their politics?
The dissimilarities between
the similarities. You said there are some similarities.
Yeah, there are similarities. The similarities in their politics. Millman is of course, depicted as someone that learns from life what is socialism, what is Marxism or communism. There isn't a lot about him as the intellectual. Nobody says in the book, it's not written that he learned Marx, but when he's in France, he looks at the French labor movement. There is an ideological similarity in the way that Johnny is depicted as someone that reads Marx and reads Plekhanov and reads very heavy Marxist writings, and he's very interested in how society works and those kind of things. But at the same time, it's a dissimilarity. Maybe they are similar in the ideology. They are all sort of in the Marxist family, but Mark Millman, first of all, learns from life. He's sort of a worker that understands things from practice, from political practice. When it comes to Palestinians, this is very striking. Johnny or Aron Shemi is, of course, fighting the 1948 war. He fights in the 1948 war. He fights against Palestinian, other Arab armies. He participates in the project of the Haganah to map and spy basically on Arab villages, and basically Palestinians sort of don't exist in his narrative unless they are the enemy or someone you spy on. When it comes to Millman, there's a famous quote of Millman that he says that, and I'm free quoting here, that he says basically, as the Arab rebellion is escalating, he says, he writes to his mother, and he says, the Arabs and Jews didn't understand that they have a mutual enemy. What are they fighting with each other? They have a mutual enemy, fascism. So it's a completely different understanding. This is understanding of the party, of a joint struggle between, or joint struggle or solidarity between Arabs and Jews. Internationalism of the brigades is sort of translated into Palestine.
And how is this? How do you read this in relation to the commemoration cults or rituals in other places around the world that you looked at in your research? What are the dissimilarities that you find between the very Israeli local commemoration and the international one?
First of all, the one that I looked at the research is East Germany. In East Germany, the anti-fascists of the brigade, the international brigade cult, and there it's really a state cult. It is a state cult. It's used to justify and legitimize a state that was very not popular and, of course, a dictatorship. And there is, a very rigid Marxist-Leninist kind of understanding of what happened in Spain. The Nazis, the Germans looked for resources, and Spain was sort of a colony that they wanted, and they found someone to collaborate in order to get economic gain. So there is this interpretation. When it comes to Palestine, they don't have the resources to have such an enormous cult around the international brigade. Parks, the monuments, mass rights, those kind of things.
But I think the point that you're trying to make is that it's not backed by the state. In East Germany, they needed this narrative, whereas you're saying in Yishuv, pre-Israel Palestine, this was a fringe group, a tiny little, not very well liked political party struggling for any sort of, not just resources, but for any sort of prominence on the political scene because they were largely rejected. Is that?
Yeah. That's definitely it. I mean, they use their newspaper. That's mostly the main tool and the main source that I understood how this cult is working. Maybe at the Communist Youth Club they'll have an evening about Spain, those kind of things.
But the interesting thing is, Amir, that in both countries, both in Israel and East Germany, they looked back on the Spanish Civil War while ignoring the elephant in the room, which was the struggle against Nazism that affected them directly, both the Germans and the Jews.
In Palestine, the connection to the Holocaust is very obvious. Mordechai Vishol, which is the author behind the Jewish captain in fighting Spain, says, the same animal that went on rampage in Treblinka is the one that went on rampage in Abyssinia and in Spain. So, and they make the connection very, very clear. and they make the connection between the volunteers and the Warsaw Ghetto fighters and so on and so on. In East Germany, yes, everybody is anti-fascist. Nobody is a Nazi in East Germany. Everybody is anti-fascist. There were these few Nazis that really trashed the picture of everybody fighting against them, including all those good anti-fascist communist Germans. In East Germany, it is used to sort of mask the guilt about what happened in World War II. Just, sort of give them a good feeling that, there were enough good Germans and anti-fascists. Like we fought in Spain. But in the case of the Palestinian or the Israeli communists, that's very obvious, that connection to what happened in World War II.
Yeah. We have to wrap up. So I'm trying to think of how to phrase this last question, because it goes back to what I said before, which is it looks like the struggle is so hard to commemorate this. I would dare say it's not a big prominent part of the Israeli public discourse nowadays at all. And I wonder if the idea that people can be brought together and put aside their differences, like, this quote that you keep saying, of how one of these figures said, can't the Jews and the Arabs realize that they have, shared common causes and they shouldn't be fighting each other? Maybe that's just never really strong enough. And these shared, again, cosmopolitan kind of causes, for people suffering in other places, maybe they're just never really enough to actually unite people over their ultimately nationalist and tribalist kind of, arguments and existential fights at home. What do you think?
Yeah, and I think you see it at the commemoration of the later commemoration of the volunteers. They become part of the Israeli consensus. There's this whole research started when I've seen the show at Museum Haaretz, at Haaretz Museum, which is mainstream. But when you see at the later commemoration, they are the communist, internationalist, and anti-Zionist volunteers, most of them, including people that are not Jews, Palestinians, are grafted into the commemoration of those that that fought in the war, in Israel's war. And the nationalist Jewish side is much more is the one that is remembered about the volunteers, the first Jews to fight against Nazism and so on and so forth, and the internationalist side is very much subsumed, and this is the sort of the price that they pay to get into the mainstream.
Yet another ideological struggle that was co-opted, one to add to a long
optimistic
list.
note.
All right, Dr. Amir Locker-Biletzky, I'm afraid this is all we have time for. You're a post-doctoral fellow at Concordia University's Azrieli Institute of Israel Studies and the author of a recently published paper, War and Memory, the Israeli Communist Commemoration of the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1986. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And thank you, Dalia, as well, and the Van Leer Institute for their generous support. If you like this podcast and many more where it came from, just go to www.tlv1.fm/podcasts and take your pick. Also, check out our new website, telavivreview.org, and like us on Facebook. You can follow me and Dalia on Twitter, and do not hesitate to get in touch with your comments and suggestions. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.
קמתי עם געגוע כואב וחשבתי אם מיד חולקת שמחות חשוב לי לשמוע שאת צוחקת הרבה ואוהבת אותי עוד פחות קמתי עם געגוע כואב והבנתי הבוקר שטוב לך לבד אני לומד לשחרר אותך למרות שקשה לי נותן לך ללכת לה